Just a reminder, today's conference is being recorded.
Okay, I just remembered to press the record button, so I will just tell you again that this is our second year hosting our Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series, and the goal is to bring together water folks from across the country to learn about and engage with emerging and innovative ideas in water policy and governance. And I want to give a nod of thanks to Elizabeth Hendricks, who is on the line today. She launched this series last year and has been very supportive of this year's initiative. Now, today's webinar, as you know, is largely inspired by the research report Shared Water One Framework, which was authored by Émilie Lagacé, who is our headlining guest speaker today. And this report was published with the support of the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation, as well as the Forum for Leadership on Water, or FLOW. And at this point, I do want to also extend a special thank you to Nancy Boucher for all of her support and assistance as a partner on the webinar today. She is the program coordinator at FLOW. And I want to thank all of our partners and sponsors, the POLIS Project on Ecological Governance, the Canadian Water Network, Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation, Water Canada Magazine, and the Living Water Policy Project. Now, before I introduce today's speakers, I do want to go over some quick ground rules and also get a sense of who is in the room today. So I know most of you have, but if you have not already, please press *6 on your telephone. This will mute your phone line, and it will reduce any extraneous noise, disturbance, weird robot feedback during the webinar. Now, since your phone lines will be muted, questions will be addressed using the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I will be moderating the question period, and all of the questions will be answered at the end of the session after all three presenters are finished. So you can either write your questions in the chat box as you think of them, or what might be better is to save them until the end and type them in at that time. And if we do have a lot of questions and can't get to them all in our time frame, please do not fear. We will be sure to follow up on any dangling questions in the summary notes that I will send out after the webinar. Now at this point, for those of you who haven't yet, I invite you to type in the chat box what organization with and how many people are listening on your end. I want us all to have a sense of who we're in the room here with today, and also it'll give me a good sense of numbers. I do know in terms of national reach, we've had people register from nearly every province and at least one territory, so I certainly welcome you all here today. So now as you continue to introduce yourselves to your fellow webinar participants, I am going to introduce our guest speakers. So our first speaker today is Émilie Lagacé. She has her MSc in Water Science, Policy, and Management from the University of Oxford, and it was during her master's degree that she became acquainted with the European Water Framework Directive. Since graduating, she has worked in the Canadian federal government and for a private consulting firm in the UK. And in 2009, she was awarded a Water Policy Fellowship from the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation, and the Shared Water One Framework report was completed while she was in that role. Émilie now lives in Ottawa, where she works at the National Capital Commission as an Environmental Strategy and Programs Officer. Second up today is Inger Weibust, and she is an assistant professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. And her research focuses on environmental regulation, globalization, and governance. And in 2009, she authored a book that some of you may be familiar with called Green Leviathan, the case for a federal role in environmental policy. And Inger's actually currently working on an edited volume focused on multi-level governance and the management of water resources and climate change. So if you haven't already, please press *6 on your telephone keypad. I can hear some noise in the background, so that would be appreciated. Thanks. So yeah, this new book that Inger is working on, you may want to keep your eyes out for that. And today she will be illuminating the governance of water pollution control in the European Union and Canada. And our third speaker today is Ralph Pentland, and he wears a number of water-related hats, He is president of the small consulting firm Weibust Enterprises. He is acting chairman of the Canadian Water Issues Council at the University of Toronto. He is a member of FLOW, and he is an advisor to the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation. And from the late 70s to the early 90s, Ralph served as Director of Water Planning and Management in the Canadian federal government, and he was the primary author of the 1987 Federal Water Policy. Over the years, he served as Canadian co-chairman of 5 different international joint commission boards and committees which deal with Canada-U.S. transboundary issues. And today, Ralph's presentation will focus on missed opportunities, and drawing on the example of the EU, he will discuss the benefits of more effective environmental regulation and management. And now I'm going to turn it over to Émilie to take over and guide us through her presentation.
Well, thank you, Laura. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, so I assume everyone else can too. If there's any issues with sound, please type them in the chat box and we'll deal with them as they come up.
Okay, well, hello everyone. All 125 of us. It's just an amazing number of people listening to this conversation today. What I want to talk about really is collaboration for water management across multiple jurisdictions. And I'll be focusing, of course, on the European Union experience, hence the title of the presentation, Shared Water One Framework, What Canada Can Learn from the European Union Water Governance. Here's my presentation outline. While it is true that Europe, just like Canada, does face challenges of jurisdictional fragmentation, unclear responsibilities, and disconnected water governance, in the late 1990s, EU governments decided that water issues were way too important to them in their development to maintain the status quo. So they've taken a courageous step forward, and in December 2000, just 11 years ago, they passed the European Union Water Framework Directive, or WFD. Now, at the time, the WFD policy, because of its ambition and features, was described as the most important initiative in water resources management to be introduced on an international basis for many years. That's a mouthful. And today, I would say that most international experts would still agree that the Water Framework Policy is the most important initiative to be introduced on an international basis in terms of water management. So in the third part of my presentation, I'll come back to what are the main characteristics of the Water Framework Directive. But before I do that, I need to give you some context in terms of, what is the European Union and what is its environmental governance. And then in the fourth part of my presentation, I'll really discuss the findings of my research. So what are the benefits from collaboration? I'll come back to that. And in the fifth part, I will introduce present two of the main implementation mechanisms, including the Common Implementation Strategy, which I'll discuss more in the fifth part of the presentation. And then I will end, of course, with my recommendations, because that is a sensible place to end. So as Laura's mentioned, I had the opportunity to be awarded a Gordon Water Policy Fellowship while I was working and living in the UK. And this meant that I had direct access to the stakeholders for the interviews that I conducted, but also because I was working at a time with Arup, an engineering firm, I became effectively a participant observer in the implementation of the directive, and that was a very unique position to be in. So I was living the WFD implementation and studying it at the same time. The aim of the research was to identify the benefits that member states are deriving from their collaboration in water management, but also to explore the governance context in which they're set, those benefits, so as to assess whether Canada and how Canada could derive similar benefits from collaborating across jurisdictions. Moving on to an introduction to the EU and its environmental governance. Well, first of all, the European Union was created in 1993 to the Maastricht Treaty. And just a few statistics to put things in context. The EU counts 27 member states, 23 official languages, and a population of just over 501 million people, I was going to say scattered, but really I should say concentrated over an area just above 4.3 million square kilometers. Water-wise, if we look at it from a relatively macro scale, that of river basin districts, which it's a concept that I'll come back to, but river basin districts are essentially the units for water management under the Water Framework Directive. The member states together share no less than 40 international river basin districts. When we compare this to the situation in Canada, I'm sure you know most of these numbers, but just a refresher. In Canada, we have 13 jurisdictions, 2 official languages, a population of 34 million people, spread out over an area of 10 million square kilometers. So we do share our waters with one international jurisdiction, but it's only one, and it is the United States. So the point I'm trying to make with this comparison is that in the EU, the pressures on water resources are really significant. And when it comes to overcoming the obstacles to water management, they're much greater than the ones we can face in Canada. And yet, the EU is the one jurisdiction that is currently implementing a common operational approach, and that is the Water Framework Directive. This one slide really is your crash course on environmental governance in the EU, so buckle your seatbelts. It's not a true federal system, but the EU certainly possesses some of its defining elements. Notably, it's got 2 levels of governments, the supranational government that's based in Brussels, Belgium, and of course national governments in individual member states. Those 2 levels of governments do share many different competencies. The environment is one of those shared competencies, but also the Single European Act in 1987 confirmed that environmental management would be one of the formal policy goals of the European integration. This really gave the EU a legal basis from which to proceed on environmental governance. By law, all EU policies, once they're adopted, have to be transposed in member state national legislation. This effectively means that any progressive environmental policy from Brussels does raise the bar for national environmental legislation. And in 1999, the Amsterdam Treaty has set out mechanisms for monitoring and, importantly, enforcement of those policies, and those mechanisms effectively authorize the EU Court of Justice to fine member states who are in infringement of EU policy. And in 2005, just to give you some numbers, the EU Court of Justice required France to pay 20 million euros in fine because they were not complying with maritime fisheries regulations. But in addition to that baseline fine, for every 6 months where they were still in infringement, they had to pay an additional 57.8 million euros. So if that doesn't convince you, I don't know what will. Moving on to what is the Water Framework Directive, what are its key features? Well, when it came into force in 2000, the Water Framework Directive effectively repealed 7 existing water policies. So those existing water policies were rolled into one framework policy, that's the WFD, so it effectively streamlined a lot of the governance on water. The Water Framework Directive, its main objective is to achieve good status for all waters by 2015. Now, what good status means has been the object of much debate, especially in the beginning after the entry into force, and it's now defined as conditions deviating only slightly from those that we find under undisturbed conditions, so as close to natural as possible. How do we measure it? Well, it's a set of indicators that are essentially grouped into 2 components, ecological components and chemical components, but I won't go any further into that during this presentation. All waters really speaks to the fact that the WFD's scope is comprehensive. It covers surface waters, groundwaters, estuarine and coastal waters. So the directive, of course, is legally binding because it's the EU policy, and it also has a fixed timeline. It promotes river basin scale management, so water management based on natural boundaries and not political boundaries. It requires member states to establish full cost pricing, so new pricing regimes for water services. And a central pillar also of the policy is citizen participation, not only for balancing the interests of the different stakeholders, but also for reasons of enforceability and ownership. One of the first tasks of the WFP was to identify the units of river basin management, and this map shows that 110 river basin districts were outlined, of which 40 of those are international, and you can see them in pink. In green, what you see are the river basin districts that are national. They only belong to one country, one member state. The largest of the international river basin districts is the Danube River. It's shared between 18 countries, including some that are not even members of the EU. And I think the last two slides really speak to the fact that the Water Framework Directive is a collaborative experience, because as I've described, the level of ambition of the directive, its objectives really demand pulling together knowledge, resources, and experience from across the EU. And as this map illustrates very well, attaining the objectives is impossible alone, because so much of the water resources are shared. So moving on to the findings of my research. So the question I posed were, what are the benefits of collaborative water governance in the EU? In the next couple of slides, I will outline the 5 main benefits that I identified in my research, and I'll also contrast them to the situation in Canada. But while I do so, I want to point out that even though my slides and even my words might seem a little like it's painting a black and white picture, really there are many shades of gray here. And that's important to understand, that not everything in the European experience is going smoothly. And we also have very positive examples of collaboration for water management in Canada. In the fellowship report, I'm more able to nuance, the shades of gray, but in a 25-minute presentation, you don't have the luxury of time, really. So what I'm going to talk about are really the headlines. The first benefit I want to discuss is that the Water Framework Directive has really strengthened transboundary cooperation. So where there are existing transboundary organizations in the EU, the mandate of those institutions has been clarified, and there's also renewed momentum for collective action. And that when there were no formal boundary institutions, some of those mechanisms have now arisen. By contrast, in Canada, many of our most significant water issues do exist in basins that we share with the United States, like Lake Winnipeg, for instance. And we do have mechanisms like the International Joint Commission that are meant to resolve disputes over boundary waters. But lately, as we know, more expedient processes have been preferred over sound, technical. Mind you, maybe they take a bit longer, but those processes have been essentially bypassed. And we know, for instance, that the dispute over Devil's Lake Outlet has not even been referred to the IJC. This is a quote that I'll give you a couple seconds to read. So Philip Weller here is really illustrating how the Water Framework Directive was the glue that is solidifying existing transboundary initiatives. The second benefit I want to highlight is that of more effective working relationships. So this work in collaboration has improved, of course, communication and generated new partnerships between member states. And these two things together over time have increased the level of trust and also the degree of, the personal networks between member state delegates. By contrast, relationships across Canadian jurisdictions in Canada have become more strained with time, and that has hindered collaboration. So we know that departmental travel budgets, for the best part, have been cut, and the opportunities to meet face-to-face are rarer. Also, the distrust between our different governments has impeded coordination, and we know, for instance, that the federal freshwater quality monitoring program has not even established monitoring arrangements with most of the provinces across the country. Now, when you read this quote, another comment that's come from my interviewees and was highlighted in a recent research report as well by the EU is that those good relationships that have been formed through the Water Framework Directive have effectively spilled over now to some other areas of governments in the EU. The third benefit from collaboration is that of increased capacity in water protection. So those stronger interpersonal networks that I was talking about in the EU have increased the sharing of expertise and also resulted in greater support for the countries that have less capacity. So as a result, we see that the level of capacity across the EU is increasing, and the countries that were lagging behind are slowly catching up to the leaders. In Canada, by contrast, knowledge transfers between jurisdictions is less clear. It's more ad hoc, and it depends on conferences, for instance, or webinars like this one. It makes it more difficult for water resources managers to always stay informed of initiatives in other jurisdictions. The fourth benefit is that of improved understanding of water resources, and that's a really important one. Because the Water Framework Directive is a results-based policy, it's triggered significant data collection efforts and also reporting by individual member states. And not only is this data being captured, it's also being collected in a standardized format, and the data is made available for all of the member states and, in fact, anybody, because they're available online, to view and use some of that data. By contrast, Canada continues to lack sufficient data to make informed decisions, and that was outlined again in the 2010 Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development Report, and also by the expert panel on groundwater. This is a quote that really, again, just highlights how we're forced to make decisions based on insufficient information because we don't know enough about our resources.
Oh, gosh, it's way too fast.
The fifth and last benefit I want to talk about is more efficient water protection. So under the Water Framework Directive, collaboration for a common operational approach has prevented a reinventing of the wheel in each jurisdiction, and that has saved considerable resources in the development of common solutions to similar problems. Most of these efficiencies are not being captured in Canada currently, so jurisdictional fragmentation has led too often to the duplication of efforts and also wasted resources. We only have to think, for instance, at the federal level, how we've got at least 20 federal agencies with some responsibility for water. Now I'd like to discuss how they make it work. So how does the EU implement a directive like the Water Framework Directive? Two main implementation mechanisms that I think are worth highlighting are funding and the common implementation strategy. In terms of funding, it's important to note that no envelope of money came with the entry into force of the Water Framework Directive. So the EU, the central government, didn't make any more money available to member states for its implementation. That's why the new water pricing regimes are so central to implementing the policy and making it sustainable in the long term. There are existing EU funding programs, and those are available to member states. Some of them do have lots of money for environmental issues or water issues, and member states can apply to those funding programs. In some cases, the funds that they will get from the EU government have to be matched by their country. And in other instances, it's funding programs where you have to come up with demonstration projects, for instance, or pair up with another member state or even another EU region. So those funding sources are available. But the most interesting one is certainly the Common Implementation Strategy, which was a new mechanism that was tried out for the implementation of the directive. The CIS is a structured process for collaboration, whereby you've got a strategic coordination group that outlines a work program for a number of working groups. And in the working groups, you mostly find experts from across the EU who collaborate to develop guidance documents. These documents are really guidance, they're non-prescriptive, and they address specific elements of the Water Framework Directive. For instance, at the very beginning, there was a committee working on the definition of good status for all waters. And more recently, there's been one around river basin management in a changing climate. So those guidance documents, I think there's over 20 now, and they are also freely available on the internet. This process of the CIS has, of course, generated a lot of interactions between member states and their delegates. And they've started new research groups, for instance, across the EU. And really, it was central to building the relationships and the partnerships that we're observing under this process. And it was such a successful initiative that it's now being repeated in the implementation of other European Union policies. An example of that is under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Coming out of that, I have 5 recommendations that I see would be useful for Canada moving forward, and perhaps starting to address at least, our jurisdictional fragmentation, unclear responsibilities, and disconnected governance. The first one is trusting relationships. We've got to rebuild relationships between our jurisdictions. And it might sound a lot easier than it actually is in practice, but I think this is fundamental. It seems to be working, and as I said earlier, it's also spilled over. Those good relationships have now improved the conditions in the implementation and negotiations of new and other EU policies. So we need to create opportunities for delegates to meet more regularly and get to know one another. We also need to invest in the next generation of water leaders. I think this is important if we want to ensure that this foundation of trust is there before they move in management positions. The second recommendation is ambition. If we are to have a national water policy, it would be sufficient. The objectives of this policy would have to be set sufficiently high to ensure first that no jurisdiction can sit back and be an observer because it's believed it's done enough. And secondly, these objectives should also be set so they cannot be achieved by working in isolation from one another. The third recommendation is having measurable results. So if we have objectives that are based on measurable results, I believe it will help Canadians to put a much higher value on understanding water resources. If we plan those appropriately, meeting objectives should translate into increased monitoring and also standardized data collection programs. Now, the fourth recommendation, meaningful consequences, as I've explained early in the presentation when I talked about environmental governance in the EU, enforcement mechanisms in the EU were established outside of the Water Framework Directive. So the fact that a European Court of Justice can fine a member state has nothing to do with the Water Framework Directive per se. It's just a regulation or a rule, if you like, that applies to all EU policies. And this is carried out by the central government, and it's proven very effective in motivating the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. So again, our Canadian federal government could build on its legal and constitutional powers to determine mechanisms that are appropriate for enforcing a national water strategy. And finally, financial resources are definitely a key factor in enabling collaboration efforts. And to ensure that these funding sources are reliable, they cannot depend solely on central government funding. They have to include self-generating revenues, such as new water pricing regimes.
I'm just going to interrupt before you finish, Emily. I just want to remind all of you to please mute your phone lines by pressing *6. We can hear some breathing on the line throughout most of the presentation, and so if you aren't muted, please, you can scroll down and find your phone number, and you'll see if you have the little mute symbol by your number there. So now, continue, Emily. I just wanted to quickly jet in there.
Yeah, well, I'm almost done. These are the two last slides, just to highlight the publication that Laura talked about, Shared Water 1 Framework, that you can download, that was published earlier this year, and you can download from the FLOW website, the Forum for Leadership on Water. It is available in English and French, and my fellowship report as well is there to be downloaded for free. And thank you to, of course, all my interviewees in Europe and Canada. There were many of you, and all of the conversations have provided something towards my research. The Walton Duncan Gordon Foundation, of course, for funding the work. FLOW, I know some of my mentors are actually listening today. Ralph Pentland is one of them. Oliver is online as well, so thank you for your guidance and support in the project. And finally, thank you to my former colleagues at Arup UK, who've also been very supportive while I was over there carrying out the research. Here's our contact information, myself, and also Nancy Gaucher, who has helped me, is a co-author actually of the Shared Water 1 Framework paper. Thank you.
Inger, are you there?
Okay, sorry.
Oh, there you are.
All
okay,
right.
We'll let Inger take over with her portion of the webinar here.
Okay, thank you very much for a very wide-ranging presentation, Emily. I'm going to drill down and focus on water pollution control and contrasting the governance of water pollution control in the EU and Canada. And this draws in large part on my book, Green Leviathan. So if we compare the constitutional framework, in the EU we have a situation where the Union has for a number of years been able to pass pollution control regulations, and the member states are compelled to put those regulations into national legislation. Failure to do so will result in the kinds of penalties that Emily mentioned. The member states do, however, have some discretion in terms of the implementation, but they have to pass legislation that embodies the EU regulation, because the EU actually doesn't regulate directly. In Canada, the federal government has some degree of authority over water pollution control, but it hasn't really chosen to pass legally binding water pollution control regulations since the 1980s. And the federal government's authority over water pollution control is primarily through its power over fisheries. In terms of legislation in the EU first began to legislate in this area in 1973. And as noted, all of the regulations that are passed are binding on EU members. And some of the most important of these regulations, beginning in the early 70s, concerned regulation of industrial sources of water pollution, water quality at beaches, drinking water quality, nitrates in water, primarily from agriculture, and also municipal sewage treatment. And it should be noted that the implementation of these directives was enormously costly. One or two of these directives cost billions of dollars to implement. So the Water Framework Directive is an attempt to integrate all aspects of water management and an attempt to shift the governance towards river basins. And Émilie spoke about what the criteria of good water quality is, which they're trying to attain. We have nothing similar in Canada in terms of overarching national legislation. The federal government's role is primarily through the Fisheries Act. However, there are very few regulations under the Act. If you compare Canada to the U.S. or the EU, it's really a handful of regulations compared with these other jurisdictions. You would certainly have regulations in the hundreds. And since the 1970s, much of the enforcement of the Fisheries Act has been left to the provinces. A number of years ago, the Auditor General criticized the federal government for failing to have any oversight in terms of how this enforcement has worked. Furthermore, in terms of regulation of industrial pollution, much of that occurs at the provincial level, where provinces set their own regulations. But this leaves a great deal to be desired in terms of transparency. It's quite difficult to find out what regulations apply to any given facility. So in Canada, in contrast to the EU, we have no national laws or regulations on drinking water quality. We have nothing on river basin management, and we don't have any laws or regulations on agricultural waste such as nitrates. Now, regulatory governance in Canada is supposed to be collaborative and trust-based. Certainly since the 1970s, the main forum for environmental policy in Canada has been the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, which is a federal provincial body, and it's cooperative. And since the 1990s, the goal was to produce Canada-wide standards, both in air and water pollution control. Quebec does not formally take part in these processes, although it generally acts in accordance with it. However, any province can opt out of the standards once they've been set. So there's no penalty for pulling out of a standard. Although this Canada-wide standards process has been going on almost 2 decades, very few standards have been set, and again, we can note that even though standards that are set, a province can opt out at any time, and there's no monitoring to ensure compliance with these standards. A recent exception to this is that the federal government announced that the Canada-wide standard for municipal wastewater, so that would be standards for sewage treatment, this was announced in the Canada Gazette in 2011. And it announced a goal of a standard of secondary sewage treatment. However, the EU and the US adopted secondary sewage treatment as their minimum standard in 1991 and 1972, respectively. In terms of implementing this in Canada, some municipalities will have until the year 2040 to comply with the secondary treatment standard. So we're looking at an enormous lag. I mean, in terms of where the technology of wastewater treatment is at, we're possibly 2 generations behind. Furthermore, even though there is a deadline of 2040, the regulation makes no provisions for any penalties for non-compliance. There's requirements for reporting, but it's not clear that anything will happen if a municipality has not upgraded to secondary sewage treatment. And given the enormous expense of implementing these measures, I think we should be skeptical that, absent some kind of financial consideration, that everyone will be in compliance. So just to summarize the contrast in the 2 regulatory schemes, in the EU, we have integrated water resources management addressing supply as well as pollution control across many different sources of water: groundwater, surface water, coastal waters. In Canada, we have enormous fragmentation across different types of water and also regions. In the EU, we have a plan for river basin management. In Canada, the focus is primarily management of water within each province. In the EU, we have extensive regulations on pollution at the EU level, whereas in Canada, we have very few national regulations. In the EU, the regulations are uniform across the EU and mandatory. In Canada, very few measures are national and mandatory. And lastly, in the EU, there is enforcement if member states fail to put a regulation into their legislation. Whereas in Canada, the provinces in particular, and municipalities to some degree also, have a great deal of autonomy in terms of what legislation they apply. So, to my mind, one of the biggest contrasts in these systems is that the EU has authority in this area, and unlike the Canadian federal government, has chosen to exercise that authority. We have fora in Canada to permit collaboration and consultation and exchange of technical knowledge. However, over the last several decades, it really has not produced effective results in terms of water pollution control. So I'll end my presentation there. Thank you.
I guess I'll go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Emily and Inger, for your excellent overviews. I think I just want to look at the subject from a little different perspective. I think there's a perception that our relatively weaker environmental performance in Canada gives us some sort of competitive advantage from an economic perspective. And I'd just like to challenge that a little bit and look at whether there may be some economic opportunities that we may be missing by not having a stronger performance. So I'm looking at it from an economic perspective. I'm going to use three examples. One is strictly the general question: can well-designed environmental regulation provide benefits both to jurisdictions and to individual industries and groups of industries? Back in 1990, the Porter hypothesis came out. He challenged the assumption that environmental regulation increases costs. He made the point that well-designed environmental regulation can both reduce waste and trigger innovation, and therefore may be good for industry. There's been a lot of further research since that time. There was a conference in McGill University last year, and much of the research that's happened over the 20 years was exposed at that time. Some of it supported the Porter hypothesis, some of it refuted it. But generally speaking, if you look carefully at it, it confirms Porter's findings if you interpret his findings correctly. One is that regulations must be well designed. A second one was that it does not always offset the cost of regulation. Innovation does not always offset the cost, but it does in the majority of cases. And the most important one is that you have to consider a time lag between the regulation and the innovation and the improvements to competitiveness and so on. There was a study done in Quebec, 17 industries, and they found that about a 3 or 4 year time lag was required to bring about that improvement in innovation. You can also look at it from the point of view of whole jurisdictions as opposed to individual industries, and there's been a lot of study done on that as well. The one that I found most credible was one at MIT, where they looked at 24 states, the 24 states with the strongest environmental regulation and the 24 states with the weakest environmental regulation. And they found a slightly positive correlation between economic performance and the strength of environmental regulation. So Stephen Myers, there's a quote here from him, at the end of his study: the all-out assault on federal and state environmental statutes now underway is unwarranted and unwise. Gutting environmental statutes merely prolongs public subsidization of inefficient and uncompetitive business. Now I'm going to, my second example is chemicals management. I'm not going to go through all of this. I'll just point out the important points. Is that the Canadian system is by no means bad. It's as good as the average one in industrial countries, I guess. But relative to the European one, it's slow. The onus is on governments, and chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. If we look at the European system, the onus is on the polluter. Every chemical manufacturer or importer must produce a dossier and submit it to government, they have to demonstrate that the chemical is safe. So it's much faster. The onus shifts to industry, and chemicals are guilty until proven innocent. They have estimated, this has been in place since 2007, they've estimated that the new system will save $60 billion in over 15 years in reduced healthcare costs. Any additional cost to industry will be fully offset by profits on new, greener chemistry products. Moving on, my third example is missed opportunities related to export business. If you look at the environmental industry, it's about, the size of it right now is about $1,000 billion per year internationally, globally. About half of that is in the water and wastewater sector. And if you look at shares of that $1,000 billion industry, the United States is about 5% in total, but about 9% of the non-U.S. part of it. In Canada, we have about a quarter of 1% of the market. In Germany, which is maybe not that much bigger than Canada and certainly a lot smaller than the United States, they have between 6 and 30% of that environmental industry, depending on which environmental sector you're talking about.
Ralph?
Yeah.
I'm just going to interrupt you quickly. Some listeners are having trouble. You're fading in and out a bit. I just want to remind you to maybe speak really clearly into your mic. I think that's the only issue.
Okay.
So if you don't mind giving that a try, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm almost at the end anyway. So the lesson here, I guess, if there is a lesson, is that environmental performance internally or domestically is likely to lead to a stronger performance in the export market. There's another factor here that comes into this, is that in Europe and Germany, especially France and so on, they've had for a very long time a huge private sector involvement in the actual ownership and operation of water and wastewater things. And that of course, gives them an advantage as well. Just summing up then, I'm suggesting here that we shouldn't always look at environmental performance, environmental regulation as a negative thing relative to the economy. And I've offered three examples here where we may actually provide improved economic performance through improved environmental performance. One is well-designed regulation. The second is improved chemicals management. And the third one is creating an environmental industry, which could be very, very profitable in the future. That $1,000 billion industry, by the way, is expected to at least double in the next 10 years to $2,000 billion. Okay, I'll leave it at that, Laura, and I'll turn it back to you for the questions.
Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. This is great. I have had one question come in so far. Let me just pull it up here. So Inger, this is from the Federation for Canadian Municipalities, came up during your presentation. How did the EU fund the costs associated with its municipal wastewater or other mandatory EU regulations?
Well, in terms of municipal wastewater, it seems as though a number of the member states obtained funds through other grant programs for other purposes. And in terms of the newer member states, basically the former East Bloc countries, they obtained substantial financial support through accession funds and things like that. However, countries like the UK basically faced the bill pretty much themselves, and in fact it was the coming of the EU bathing water regulation was a factor in prompting Margaret Thatcher to push for the privatization of water boards because she could see that the enormity of the investment that was going to be required was going to compel increases in the water rates, and I guess didn't want to have to take political responsibility for that. So they did cover, the wealthier member states did have to cover a portion of it themselves, but the poor member states got funding through their regional cohesion funds. Unlike in the United States, there wasn't a single fund attached to these initiatives solely for the purposes of building wastewater infrastructure.
Okay. I can see that a few people are typing questions right now, so we'll just wait for those to roll in. Okay, so Sarah Pierce, Émilie, are you suggesting any changes in constitutional powers between the provinces and federal government? Are you there, Émilie?
Okay, I think my mute is off now.
Okay.
I don't think I am. That would be, first of all, a very lengthy process, and I assume very difficult to do. I think there's a lot we can do before going through, a change in constitutional arrangements. There's mechanisms that are in existence that we could either use better, and actually the federal government could use some of its enforcement powers better, for instance, the Fisheries Act. And there's a lot of collaboration that can happen without any formal legal framework as well as a start. And the CCME is certainly a good mechanism for that. It's just that the guidance that the guidelines that it's published haven't been either accepted by all provinces, or as Ingrid described, they haven't led to much results or much impact. But I'm not suggesting something as far as constitutional changes between our provinces and federal government.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that the case could be made that the federal government has substantial powers in this area. It has simply chosen not to really exercise them since the 1980s. So, for example, a case like Crown-Zellerbach, the Supreme Court ruled that under some conditions there was a basis for the federal government to act on water quality through the peace, order, and good government power, which clearly could be very broad-ranging and wouldn't depend on the presence of fish. But the federal government has largely been in retreat from this file.
Okay, Inger, next question from Jean Bennett. Did you consider the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, 1999, and regulations under CEPA, as part of your analysis?
My analysis did focus primarily on the sewage treatment issue and drinking water quality, largely because it's very easy to determine whether or not the measures are being actually complied with. To find out, what the level of sewage treatment is in a Canadian city is a relatively simple task. I find that CEPA is really lacking in transparency, and so I really didn't emphasize that. But I would certainly welcome finding out more about those procedures. Just to point on the CCME water quality objectives. The CCME does publish large amounts of water quality objectives. However, these are standards for water, in rivers and in lakes, and that has no feedback to making anybody reduce any pollution. It's just what we call an ambient standard. So this contrasts quite strongly with other jurisdictions, the European Union and also the U.S., where there are some kind of standards to limit how much facilities can produce. The CCME has not taken that approach at all.
Yeah, actually, can I add on that?
Yep.
Yeah, it's exactly what Ingrid said. In the Water Framework Directive, we talk about a combined approach to pollution control. So that's what was described. In other words, you've got emission limit values. You limit what's allowed to be emitted in water bodies, and also the ambient standard, which is, what's the end result, what quality of water can you measure in the water body.
Okay, next question is from John McDonough Dumler. In the United States, there is provision for interstate compacts between states. Is there a similar mechanism in Canada?
Well, John, I'm really happy that you asked that question because I'm probably one of the few people alive who knows about interstate, particularly pollution control compacts. Just to fill people in, interstate compacts, and I wrote a lot about this in my book, Green Leviathan. Interstate compacts are like treaties between American states, however, they are enforceable in federal court. So they're like an enforceable contract. And prior to the U.S. federal government strongly entering the water pollution control area with legislation in the early 1970s, there were interstate water pollution control problems, and there were serious attempts made to resolve these, really beginning in the 1920s, through interstate compacts. In terms of all the interstate rivers that were polluted, I think I counted there was about 25, and of those about 8 negotiated compacts, and of those 8 that were negotiated, only 1 could really be shown to be effective in pollution control at all. And in the book I go into details about why that is. The state water compacts that receive a lot of attention now are actually water supply compacts. So these guarantee downstream states a certain volume of water, and those are very much alive and relevant and subject to ongoing litigation. In Canada, apparently there's some dispute as to whether or not provinces can actually enter into legally binding agreements with each other. In any case, there is nothing analogous in Canada, and there's nothing compared to a compact. And to my knowledge, there's no such thing as an enforceable interprovincial agreement.
I might just add on the one example in Canada that's closest, perhaps, is the Prairie Provinces Water Board, where the three Prairie Provinces have entered into an agreement on the sharing of water. It also has water quality requirements at the boundaries. It's not directly enforceable, but there is a dispute resolution mechanism in it to refer any disputes to the federal court. So they're not legally binding directly between the provinces, but it becomes somewhat legally binding by bringing the federal government into it.
Although, has it ever gone to the federal court?
It never has.
Are there any cases of that?
No, it never has.
Okay.
It's still there, but it's no.
Okay, so a few more questions have come in, specifically for Émilie. In Europe, where management is on a river basin basis, is watershed management planning strictly a government activity, or do other non-governmental stakeholders participate, i.e. industry, NGOs, etc.?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and that's probably where, when I said in my presentation that I was living the implementation of the Water Framework Directive while I was there, I got to witness a lot of those consultation exercises. So the answer to the question is no, it's not strictly a government exercise. It's not supposed to be. It really is meant to be inclusive. So, for instance, member states were supposed, if one looks at the timeline of the implementation of the directive and what activities and reports, should happen at certain dates, the consultation process, including NGOs, members of the public, industry, etc., as I said, very inclusive, should have started in 2006 in all of the river basin districts across the EU, in order to produce the first river basin management plans, and at the end of 2009, I think December 2009 was the deadline. So we're a good 3, maybe 4 years of consultation just to produce the first river basin management plan.
Okay, and I should have said that question was from Brian Free. Next question from Brenda Lucas, also directed at Émilie. Can you give an update on the full cost pricing requirement? And did members meet the 2010 deadline, and how has it affected actual prices?
Also a very interesting question, and because the deadline was 2010, and typically when a deadline is 2010, it tends to be like December, the end of the year. So that's a really recent deadline. And I don't believe I've got the full answer to your question, Brenda. But there is a report that I skimmed through. It's just over 200 pages now, and it's just come out by the European Union in June. And it touches a little bit on the debate that was around those new pricing regimes. For some member states, it's something that's already done, right? So the UK, for instance, most of the water over there, the water treatment services and water distribution services are privatized. So in effect, the consumers will absorb the cost for that. And there are, because I was living there are increases coming towards the consumer I think there's different cycles where they have to renegotiate contracts between the service providers, and there's a body that oversees this whole negotiation process to ensure that consumers are not charged an excessive amount. But there are some increases being discussed, and they are triggered by some of the pollution control measures and the Water Framework Directive, and also some of the climate change policies. So it is increasing the prices of water in the UK, and if we come back to the picture across the EU, some countries are still resisting, some member states are still resisting the introduction of new pricing regimes for all sorts of reasons, and in some cases they are limiting it to only the treatment of water services and the distribution of water to consumers, whereas the Water Framework Directive really would like those new pricing regimes to consider externalities and things like flood defense as well, and other infrastructure that affect human beings in general, but the population in general, but not specifically, what you drink and what you drink in your tap and put back in the treatment. So it is a bit of a hot potato. And I think I could point you to a good first report that's come out and addresses that issue.
Great. Yeah, Emily, if you have a link to that report, you can perhaps send it to me, and I will send it out after the webinar to those who are interested.
Absolutely.
Okay, so next question, you may have touched on this a bit already, from Nelda Craig. How prescriptive are the requirements or guidance provided by the EU framework to member states?
Well, the guidance document specifically, I think I'll step back from that and just pick up on a comment that Inger has made towards EU legislation in general. So they set objectives and a framework for member states, but the member states have a lot of flexibility and discretion into how they're going to implement the directive. So by stating the Water Framework Directive, by stating that all member states need to achieve good status for all their waters by 2015, it was still really vague. So, how do you unpack all of those concepts? So the guidance documents that have been prepared mostly through the Common Implementation Strategy process are not binding, and they are really meant to be guidelines. So member states could choose to ignore them. However, because they definitely are not binding, they are there for information and for assistance. However, the experts groups, the groups of experts that have been working at developing those guidance have been also very inclusive, so reaching out to different regions of the EU to make sure that they apply more or less across the board. And the mechanisms, the support, if you'd like, mechanisms to implement those guidance documents are there as well. So the knowledge has been developed together, and you've got an advantage at following those guidance documents, not only because the language has been established and you've got the support network, but also because it will facilitate your reporting requirements as well, because at several points in the implementation of the Water Framework Directive, member states have to report on their progress.
Oh my God.
I just heard an oh my God. And it would facilitate, it facilitates the process of reporting if you're following those guidance documents.
Okay, and another question from Sarah Pierce. In terms of the EU, what were the barriers in implementing full cost accounting for water systems? Increased rates are a tough political sell, especially in times of economic downturn.
I didn't hear the last part of the question.
She just says increased rates are a tough political sell, especially in times of economic downturn.
Yeah, I think I'm not, as I said earlier when I addressed Brenda's question, I don't think I can answer that question, fully because of the current situation, because this milestone was just achieved, and there's some reviews being made, and I don't think I can give much information on that, but she's right. I mean, in general, it is, with the economic downturn, it will be very difficult, even for actually the UK as a prime example, to push those increases in water rates to its consumers. So it's definitely not an easy sell, but they will have to find a compromise between meeting the objectives of the EU directives and also, not struggling, not making their population struggle too much with increases of, the basic services like water, for instance.
Okay.
I'll just weigh in on that one briefly.
Yeah.
One possible explanation for why the EU has been able to do this is that, as many political scientists have argued, the EU, to a degree, has a democratic deficit. The European Commission, it's accountable to the member governments, and it's also accountable to a degree to the European Parliament, but it has a rather substantial degree of autonomy from voters. It is quite a bit more politically insulated than, say, the Canadian or federal or provincial cabinet. And one argument could be made that relative insulation from direct political pressure and accountability means that there is more room for technocratic policy making. The EU Water Framework Directive is a policy that looks like what a water policy designed by water policy wonks would look like. And in Canada, we don't really let those people near the levers of policy making to that degree. It's much more political. It's much more controlled by politicians, for good or ill.
I might just add a little bit of a reality check using the chemicals management as an example. Apparently they are running into some implementation problems because you can set the requirements at the level of the union, and industries are required to produce dossiers in a certain time and of a certain quality. But at the union level, they don't have the power to make that happen in a timely way. That has to happen within the countries where the industries exist. So they are having growing pains because of the structure of the union, and I think it's not much different than the problems they're having with the debt crisis in Greece, where the basic structure of the union doesn't always facilitate easy implementation of some things.
Okay, thanks to all of you. This is very enlightening. I think that's it. No questions have come in for a few minutes now. Oh, wait a minute. All presenters from Kevin Mercer. Do EU countries utilize stormwater user pay utilities for WFD stormwater rules as the U.S. CWA, I don't know what all of these acronyms stand for, I'm sorry, NPDES Phase 1 and 2 regulations does. How can Canada learn to utilize these user pay utilities to address unfunded infrastructure debts?
I don't know about the acronyms either. In Canada, if you compare Canada and Europe in terms of pricing of water and wastewater services, we charge a lot less and perform a lot less poorly because of that. We still have lots of space between what we pay and the full cost pricing in Canada. The last time I looked, we pay about 70% of the full cost of our water and wastewater infrastructure. I don't know about the details, but in principle, we still pay too little and perform too poorly.
Okay, so just to clarify, Kevin, so it's the U.S. Clean Water Act. The NPDES is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, Phase 1 and 2. So there's some stormwater use pay as part of that. Sorry, Inger, were you going to?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in on this. I'm not certain that the EU has stormwater regs. I don't remember seeing any. I know that in Germany there is a requirement to treat stormwater, but it does, paint a picture of how far behind Canada is in this area. I mean, we really are decades behind when we're still trying to figure out how to clean up inadequately treated sewage, and other countries are contemplating storage and treatment of stormwater runoff.
Just to add to that, in the UK, again, because I used to have my own water bills, of course, while living there is a fee for the treatment of surface water as well in your utility bills. So not only do you pay for the water you receive, the treatment of your black water that you put back, but also any surface water that you're responsible for is also there's also a fee for that.
Okay, interesting. Well, I think now I can officially say that there aren't any more questions coming in. So unless any come in the next minute or so, I'm going to call the question period at a close. I want to thank all of you for that feedback, participation, questions that really add to the whole webinar experience. So at this point, I do want to just remind you that there are a number of upcoming webinars in the POLIS Water Sustainability Project webinar series. So coming up with the Creating a Blue Dialogue series, we have webinars in October. That one's just around the corner on reinventing rainwater management in Canada. And then in January, March, and May, we're going to have more webinars, and you can read the details there. Unfortunately, I don't have specific dates for all of those yet. That will be coming very soon, especially for the October one, since it's right around the corner. So I'll be in touch with all of you who have participated in previous webinars to give you those details, and we would love to see you out again. So I will, just for a while, leave the chat box open. You can chit-chat with each other. Inger, Emily, and Ralph, do you want to just give a sign-off?
I'd just like to say thank you to everyone, and thank you for the stimulating questions. It was very worthwhile.
Thank you to everybody who attended. It's a very good turnout. Thank you.
I will just echo Ingrid and Ralph's words, so thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Okay, and thank you to all of our presenters, and again to all of our partners and supporters and sponsors. So we will see you again in October. Take care.